Thanks, Gianluca. And it's great to see so many familiar faces here. I have this kind of lofty title, and maybe I apologize for that. My role here, I want to be kind of descriptive as opposed to visionary, and just describe for you a little bit about some of the challenges we've had leveraging the national computing resources for discovery and understanding. At Cascade, it's really our focus right now, one of the important focuses that we have. Just to motivate this, I think we all recognize the opportunity, and Fred, I was glad to see that you'd done the same bit of math here. You know, this is a little excerpt from the latest Top 500 plot. They always plot the sum of all of the computers too, and that's kind of hopeful, isn't it? I don't think we'll ever get to use that, but this is the biggest machine on the earth. Here's the actual 500th on the list. It's representative of an industry machine, and as Fred mentioned, maybe somewhere down here is your desktop. But this gap is 5 years. And of course, these are on a really exponential trajectory as well. So there's no doubt that our current national computing infrastructure is unique, it's enormous, and it's growing. And there's also many opportunities for awards and partnerships. At a very high level in the United States, at the level of Congress, they're interested in enhancing the competitiveness of the industries that we have here in the States. And so there are many opportunities for awards, and really this offers strategic access to computing power that's 5 years and 100x ahead of the best industry standards. And so that's the carrot. It's not simple though. And in my experience, we're pursuing a model that looks like this. It has this ingredients for success. The first piece the first piece of course is the architecture, and we're going to leave that to the experts. But an important component of being successful is scalable software infrastructure. And this software infrastructure is on a trajectory, there's no question about that, but it has to work today as well. And it has the components of scalable solvers, and I'll talk a little bit about that, that's a given. But actually there's other scaling issues that we need to get into to make these things useful and learn from them. The first is we need to be able to scale up the problem on the machine. You know, a real problem, we can't just type in 1024 cubed and get a big calculation. Real problems involve real geometries, real meshes, real chemistry. These problems are very difficult, and you can't just send them in a FedEx envelope to Argonne. You need to be able to scale them up on the machine. And you also need to close the loop and scale down the results to get them off the machine and into the brain of someone who actually understands what you're computing. And I think there's an important analogy that we could draw here. As we move towards exascale, we need an important focus on diagnostics as well. How we diagnose these simulations that we're doing. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing in this regard. A critical ingredient for any area that's hard and moving quickly is to put together smart, agile teams. And I also believe, at this point, for us at least, we need a link to real products. And I think that allows us to formulate the right questions, it allows us to have real impact, and obviously it allows us to have funding, sort of an indirect funding through a partner. This is what we're doing right now with the group we put together at Cascade in partnership with various pieces of GE. We've had some success computing in the past and going forward at Argonne, and these are a couple of the projects that we're involved in that include this group. Okay, so let me talk about scalable solvers first. This is just a scalability plot that we were lucky enough to be able to produce because we had early access to Sequoia before it kind of went into the dark. And so this was a big machine at still is a big machine at Lawrence Livermore. It's not in the public domain anymore. And we were able to get our codes on here, and for a jet noise problem that Joe Nichols, who's now a professor at Minnesota, was computing at the time, he showed just strong scaling of a problem up to over 1 million cores. So, I was at Stanford for the last decade, and it's been great to see the axes, down here go from 64 to 1 million in that decade. It's been pretty exciting times. The challenge here, though, is that this is a multi-physics problem. This is a snapshot from it here. It's It's a hot jet coming out of a rectangular orifice with chevrons. There's sound going everywhere. It's supersonic. It's got shocks. And the scaling of this problem is not just about distributing it evenly over the computer. Not at all. It's complicated because it has dynamically varying load. And the dynamically varying load in this case is associated with the shock capturing scheme. So the numerical method actually exercises different levels of work depending on the dynamics of the flow. It's transient, so these things are traveling all over the place. So that's where the dynamic varying load comes from. And as a consequence, to do this and get efficiency out of these systems, the solver infrastructure has to support this kind of periodic rebalancing. So what this made us do is something that Bill and Pat have been telling us for a long time, but it's basically hold the data structures loosely when you write your codes. If you wrote a CFD code 20 years ago, what you did was you carefully designed your data structures. And then once that was set, you went ahead and built everything around those. Now you need to hold those a little more loosely. Maybe completely loosely, as some of the domain-specific languages are describing. You know, Jackie mentioned that Exascale is probably not going to mean that we build big databases and then go back and revisit them. That's not necessarily true. I mean, if we think about solving adjoint systems or other problems, we probably will have a big out-of-core component. And so I/O is going to remain an important part of these systems, you know, collecting this data, revisiting it later. And so we looked at I/O scalability while we were on Sequoia as well. And what we found is that when we first just ran this simulation of jets, the I/O was awful. You know, this is the throughput in gigabytes per second that we were getting for our I/O at 1 million cores. And unfortunately, it just grinds the whole thing to a halt. What we found, though, was that by making use of some of the architectural, by essentially holding the data loosely and making use of some of the architectural decisions that were made in the software already, we were able to write to the disk from much fewer cores, and this is the ratio of write cores to total cores. We could vary this architecturally based on the design. And we were able to find an optimal point, which is still modest relative to the real hardware capabilities, but let me explain why. And this maybe gets to some of the complications with trying to do real simulations. So here I've got a picture which shows you how the I/O works for one of our codes. We take a simulation that's partitioned for the simulation across the processors, and I'm just showing that here with this coloring. Now, before that gets written to the file system, we actually reorder it. Reorder it in memory. It's an enormous transpose operation. And the reason we do this is because it gives robustness to the final data structure. If we go back and have to compute on a different number of cores or utilize a post-processing utility, that reordering is an important step of getting robustness into the meaning of the files that we actually write. Now, when you write from every core, that reordering process is what was kind of slowing the file system down. But it was easy for us to just introduce a split in the communicator, use the reordering process to actually reorder to a reduced number of nodes, and write to the file system and gain all of this efficiency. So this is essentially an example of holding the data structure loosely. It's being managed dynamically as a transpose in the computer at the time, and we were able to recover I/O rates that were acceptable to us. I mentioned also that scaling up the problem is really important. When the problem's complicated, it's not just a question of increasing the resolution. Or maybe if it is a question of increasing the resolution, that's very challenging. So one of the things we've really been focused on at Cascade is building tools which allow you to increase the resolution arbitrarily and in very flexible ways. Here's an example of a chevron array on the exit of a nozzle, typical of one of the nozzles that we would compute at Cascade for noise. This is an example of a complicated mesh in a combustor sector where we've wanted to refine the grid and understand the grid-dependent aspects of the calculation. This can be done now as part of the simulation process. And it can also be done in a solution-dependent way. These kinds of tools are going to be critical to allow real problems to scale up on these systems. the other piece of the puzzle, as I mentioned too, is scaling down the results. I mean, maybe a little bit different from Fred, I think an Excel spreadsheet will still have a very important role going forward. And sometimes you have to get down to that single number or that graph in the hands of the analyst who can make decisions. And so these results, we have to get them into the brain of someone who can gain insight from them. And I try to think of analogies in other industries where this occurs. Like, is it really the programmer that has to understand the device that's being simulated to get the insights? And the analogy that occurred to me a while ago was that of a radiologist. You know, a radiologist is imaging the body and looking for disease and has a sort of knowledge about disease and doesn't really care about the imaging infrastructure or the CT scanner or MRI scanner. And I think this kind of diagnostics has to be a complementary part of what we do as we go to Exascale. So in our codes we have probes and traditional parallel visualization approaches. We do expression parsing, but we also do imaging. And so you can take a simulation, and instead of using the high-performance computing to do the calculation, you switch over and move into an imaging mode. And you can draw, it's amazing how easy imaging is, actually. It's a really nice problem to solve when you have a chance to do it. And you can drop out, you can rapidly drop out an enormous number of images and inspect the entire three-dimensional domain in an iPhoto, if you want to. And so this is an important piece of doing dimensional reduction that we're focused on. So let me finish off just by describing to you specifically a few discoveries or understandings that were really made by leveraging these resources right in the present day. One of them, you may have heard a talk given by Joe Nichols in the past. He was really the principal investigator of this work. I worked with him closely, though, to make sure that the code supported this activity. And Joe was interested in the problem of crackle. So when you have a supersonic jet issuing from a nozzle, and it's high temperature often as well, sometimes it can crackle, which means that there's a component to the sound that kind of sounds like, clapping. Very loud, though. And like a few of the great problems in the world, there's a lot of debate as to the cause. And this is what's exciting about this problem. There was a camp of people that thought that this crackling problem was a nonlinear propagation problem, sort of unrelated to the jet, but as the waves left the jet, they were strong enough that those nonlinearities are what resulted in the steepening, and by the time you eventually arrived at the observer or the microphone, that's where you heard the nonlinearity, the crackling. The other camp thought that maybe it was some embedded noise sources, but there wasn't evidence for this. And so what Joe did was he went off and said, fine, let's compute it and see what we get. And so he took a nozzle that crackles, partnered with Steve Martins at GE, John Spiropoulos, who is here from the Navy, and us in terms of the simulations. Sanjeeva Lele was involved in this work too. And gridded this thing up and started to compute the flows. And so here I'm going to show you just a shot of one of his calculations. It's not looping, by the way, on a big resource like the ones we have access to at Argonne in this case, or at the ERDC, one of the computational divisions of the Department of Defense. You can run for a long time. And what you're looking at here is the temperature field in grayscale in the center of this jet. It's obviously exhausting from left to right, like every good fluid mechanics person does. And you're looking at the pressure field, and you can see evidence of crackle when the pressure amplitudes go into the green. So it's a very uncommon phenomenon. It's not happening all the time. But the important thing is Joe observed evidence of it and was able to start to go back into these simulations and diagnose the causes of it in the near field of the jets and penetrated the shear layer. So even though nonlinear steepening is likely present in these problems, there's definitely strong evidence now for the near-field sources of crackle noise. And this points to great possibilities in the sense that you can control crackle. And in fact, Steve Martins, who was a partner in this research, has demonstrated experimentally that crackle can be controlled by near-field modifications of the nozzle through introduction of chevrons, for example. So These high-fidelity LESs enabled observation of these N-shaped waves, and in a sense, they addressed this controversy or this dichotomy that was going on. And you can get more information on this. Joe's published a bit about it, and I know he continues to analyze the real cause of Crackle and the interaction of these nonlinearities in the shear layer. Let me give one other example just before I conclude. And I want to start with just a piece of background information. We look at these simulations visualized sometimes with all the vorticity, and I wonder what it means or what I'm supposed to understand. I mean, it looks complicated. But sometimes there's a picture that emerges that gives you a way to think about what's going on physically in a simulation. Now, this was one that Mirko Gamba produced as part of our PCEP Center here at Stanford. This is an experiment of a sonic jet of hydrogen in supersonic crossflow. And there were some grad students in Godfrey Mungel's lab earlier than him, earlier than Mirko, who were actually imaged this for the first time. But what they did was they took their planar laser sheet and put it right near the wall of this jet that's being introduced. So you've got a jet that's issuing into the environment where we are, and there's a crossflow going across. And you're asking yourself, well, where is the fuel? Well, it turns out that the fuel is all over the place in that boundary layer. Many, many diameters upstream into this Mach 2 crossflow, and all the way to the right and left as well. I mean, I honestly think that this is remarkable, and I know that these guys found this remarkable when they first saw it. We were able to reproduce this phenomena using simulations. So this is an example of a reacting flow simulation under similar conditions, and I really wish this had been the other way around. If we had seen it in the simulation first and then told them to put the sheet there, but it wasn't. But there are examples where it has been the other way around. But this is a great example of how you think now about the mixing process of a supersonic jet. So an application of this that we looked at on one of the national facilities is to look at the supersonic combustion problem. And in the mean, you can capture pressure measurements and compare that data to experiments and show that, for various assumptions with the chemistry, you can recover these pressure traces quite accurately. But what's really exciting is actually to look at the instantaneous fields with what I've just showed you about that jet in crossflow. So this is a combustor that's fed by similar jets in crossflow, and I'm visualizing here essentially the temperature. It's the progress variable in our combustion method, but it's essentially the temperature in the near boundary layer. And I want to show you what happens to this combustor when we run it. So an interesting thing happens. The combustion creeps up along the sidewall, and we know that there are interesting corner vortices that live in sidewalls. The time scales are very slow. And so that mixing of fuel out on the flat plate boundary layer is interacting with the sidewall vorticity, and it's actually leading to a huge instability in this combustor that we're predicting with this simulation, where it actually essentially unstarts and goes subsonic and then goes back to sonic conditions. And so this is an insight that we got into a potential instability. Now it's not clear whether this instability was observed experimentally, and we're trying to reproduce, understand its sensitivity right now as we go forward. This just shows you a couple of pictures, and I want to say that this is the work of Amy Reza, who's going to be talking this afternoon in a lot more detail about this particular case. So with that, I'll conclude. I want to acknowledge the team that we've put together at Cascade. Joe is an honorary member. He worked as a consultant for us during his last couple of years here. And obviously the computational resources at Argonne and the ERDC and AFRL facilities have made this all possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Frank.